He paid £50,000 for her. That's the price of a duchess, and the full measure of her family's shame. The Duke only needs an heir. He swore on his first wife's grave he would never love again, not even the woman standing opposite him at the altar. But she carries a secret that could break his iron control. The moment he touches her, does he destroy his vow or destroy them both? Welcome back, my wonderful family and friends. What are your thoughts on the journey from duty to love in a marriage? Can two people bound by circumstance truly find love in each other? Share your opinions in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more captivating stories of love, sacrifice, and transformation. London in the spring of 1878 was a city of contrasts. The fog clung to the streets like a secret, the clamour of horse-drawn carriages echoing off the stone buildings as gaslights flickered like distant stars, struggling to pierce the haze. The Edward family's townhouse stood on Grosvenor Square, one of the grandest addresses in all of London. But even the finest of homes could not escape the ravages of time. The Edward residence, once a beacon of respectability, was now a place that spoke of faded opulence. The elegant drawing rooms, where London's most powerful and influential families once gathered, now bore the marks of genteel decay, faded wallpaper, scuffed furniture, and the lingering scent of desperation. The walls, once adorned with grand portraits of ancestors, now echoed only with the whispers of ruin. In the evenings, the drawing rooms were lit by gaslight, casting soft shadows over the tired faces of the Edward family. The air was thick with the weight of Victorian society's expectations, where appearances meant everything, and a single misstep could send a family from grace to disgrace. And within this world, Elizabeth Edward stood, caught between the woman she had once dreamed of becoming and the role she was now being forced to play. At 21, Elizabeth had inherited both her mother's beauty and her father's intelligence, yet the weight of her family's impending ruin bore heavily on her slender shoulders. She stood at the window of her father's library, gazing out over the cobbled streets of Grosvenor Square, her hands pressed against the cold glass as if trying to feel the pulse of the city. The carriages passed by, their polished wheels clicking on the stones, each one carrying the whispers of London's elite. She watched them, a silent observer to a world she would never fully be part of again. Her chestnut hair, meticulously arranged, framed her face, while her grey eyes, though intelligent and sharp, now carried a look of quiet resignation. Her posture, graceful and dignified, still bore the mark of her upbringing, yet beneath that composed exterior, she was no longer the hopeful young woman who once dreamt of love and adventure. She was a woman on the verge of being sold her future, sealed by a debt her brother had racked up, one that could not be erased except by a bargain no one had asked her to make. Elizabeth had often imagined this moment, though never like this. As a child, she had dreamed of a marriage full of affection, where she would be cherished by a man who saw her as more than just a means to an end. But now, as she watched the carriages roll past, she knew that dream was far from reach. Instead, her future was about to be dictated by the cold, emotionless exchange of her hand in marriage. Her father, Lord Edward, was a proud man, once respected by his peers, but in recent months, the mounting debts had stripped him of his dignity. Thomas, her reckless younger brother, had gambled away the family fortune, £50,000 owed to dangerous creditors whose names were whispered in fear. The debts had already begun to taint the family's reputation, and now they faced a scandal that would ruin them completely. Elizabeth had overheard her father's hushed conversations late into the night, his voice strained with exhaustion. The rumours had already begun to circulate in society. No one could forget the name Edward now, and with the debts still unpaid, her younger sister, Georgiana, had no hope of making a respectable debut in society. The Edwards were on the brink of collapse, their noble standing hanging by a thread. Her mother, once a woman of grace and elegance, now moved with quiet sorrow, her steps slow and weary. She had done all she could to maintain appearances, but the cracks in their once pristine facade were beginning to show. Elizabeth's mother could no longer hide the truth from her daughter, and in the silence of the Edward residence, the weight of their ruin was about to be settled by the sacrifice of a single woman's future. The knock on the door was expected. Elizabeth had been told that Duke William Alfred would be arriving at precisely 2:30 in the afternoon. She had not been prepared, however, for the man who stepped into their drawing room. William Alfred was tall, impeccably dressed in black with dark, almost black hair and piercing ice-blue eyes that betrayed nothing. His presence filled the room with an almost oppressive calmness, as though he were a man who had already seen and conquered every challenge life could throw at him. He was known as the Frozen Duke, a man who had not smiled in society for 8 years, ever since the death of his first love, Rosalind. The loss had shaped him, turned him into the unfeeling, cold figure that now stood before her. His reputation was one of power and control. He had built his wealth on the backs of others, his title and influence untouchable. He had no need for affection or tenderness. He had everything he needed, except for an heir to carry on his name, and for that he had come to Elizabeth. "Miss Edward," he began, his voice steady and emotionless, "I require a wife. You require salvation from ruin. I propose an arrangement beneficial to both parties." Elizabeth felt her pulse quicken. The words were blunt, the tone cold, and the reality of what was happening settled like a heavy weight in her chest. She could not look away from him, yet she could not find the words to respond. Her father stood behind his desk, a mixture of relief and shame etched across his face. The deal had been struck. William would pay the debts, wipe the slate clean for the Edward family, and in return, Elizabeth would marry him. She would be a duchess, honored and respected in society, but not loved. "I will marry you, Miss Edward, but you must understand this. I will never love you. You will bear me a son, as is your duty, and when you do, you may live as you wish, discreetly, of course." His eyes fixed on hers, unblinking and cold. "There is no need for affection between us. This is a transaction. You will play your part, and I will play mine." Her heart trembled, but her resolve remained intact. This was not a choice. It was an inevitability. And though the weight of his words sank deep into her soul, she knew that this was the only way to save her family. "Then we have an agreement," William said, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I will settle the debts, and in return, you will become my wife. The wedding will take place in 2 weeks' time." Elizabeth's father nodded, barely able to contain his relief. Her mother, however, stood quietly by the window, tears threatening to spill. Elizabeth, still silent, felt her hands tremble at her sides. She had no voice in this decision, and yet she would have to live with it for the rest of her life. That night, Elizabeth sat alone in her chamber, her mind racing. The room was dimly lit, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. She had always dreamed of a love that would sweep her off her feet, of a man who would cherish her, not simply use her as a pawn in a game of aristocratic survival. But those dreams were long gone. She thought of Georgiana, who would never have a chance at a respectable marriage now. She thought of her parents, who had given so much of themselves to maintain appearances, only to watch it all crumble in the face of financial ruin. And then, she thought of herself trapped in a marriage to a man who would never love her, who would never see her for who she truly was. But there was no other option. Elizabeth stood and walked to the window, her eyes searching the darkness beyond. The gaslights of the city below flickered like stars. She closed her eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and made her decision. "I will do this," she whispered to herself, "but I will not be broken by it." As the days passed, wedding preparations began with mechanical efficiency. The dresses were ordered, the invitations sent, and the guest list finalized. Elizabeth stood at her window, watching the world of London continue on as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. In 2 weeks, she would become the Duchess of Ashford Hall. The Edward family's fate had been sealed, and her future was now bound to a man who would never love her. But she would face it with her head held high, even if her heart trembled in the quiet corners of her mind. In 14 days, she would become a duchess. In 14 days, she would enter a prison gilded with title and duty, and she would do so with her head held high, even if her heart trembled. The morning sun filtered through the tall stained glass windows of St. George's, Hanover Square, casting a kaleidoscope of colors onto the marble floors below. The Gothic interior of the church seemed to pulse with a quiet reverence, its towering spires reaching toward the heavens, while the pews filled with London's most elite families. 400 guests had gathered, their eyes fixed on the front, where Elizabeth Edward stood in silence, her delicate form shrouded in the weight of her fate. The air was thick with expectation, each whisper more pointed than the last. A marriage of necessity, they murmured, as if the very thought could taint the union before it even began. Elizabeth, dressed in white silk and Valenciennes lace, her veil a thick shroud that concealed her face from the world, felt as though she were standing at the edge of a precipice, the weight of her future pressing down on her chest. The fabric clung to her slender form, cold and heavy, as though it, too, understood the cost of what was being asked of her. She had imagined this day as a child, dreaming of walking down the aisle toward a man who would look at her with admiration, whose gaze would soften as they exchanged vows of eternal love. But now, as she stood in front of the altar, those childish fantasies seemed distant, replaced by a harsh reality she could neither escape nor change. At the altar, Duke William Alfred stood as a statue, tall, immaculate, and distant. He wore the ceremonial mourning dress with a perfection that almost seemed unnatural. His ice-blue eyes were fixed forward, his jaw set, as though any sign of emotion would betray the impenetrable wall he had built around himself. His gaze never flickered toward her, as though she were nothing more than a formality, a necessary step in a transaction that had been sealed before they even met. The priest's voice echoed through the church, but the words felt hollow. The vows were exchanged mechanically, as if both parties were reciting lines from a play they had memorized long ago. When William said, "I do," it was not a declaration of affection, but rather a statement of duty, cold and distant. The sound of Elizabeth's own voice trembling as she said, "I do," was the only sign that the words carried any weight at all. But even then, her voice remained steady, careful to mask the emotions swirling within her. The exchange of rings was equally indifferent. William's hands were cold as he placed the band on her finger, his movements precise and efficient, but devoid of tenderness. And when their lips met in the briefest of kisses, it was not the seal of love, but of a bargain, a business transaction that would bind them for the rest of their lives. The touch was so brief, it might not have happened at all. The celebration at Ashford House, William's grand London residence, was as opulent as one would expect from a duke's wedding. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceilings, casting shimmering light over the ballroom, and servants moved like ghosts, their presence barely noticeable as they carried trays of champagne and canapes. The hum of quiet conversations filled the air, but there was no joy to be found in the room, only the calculated politeness of aristocratic society. As Elizabeth and William stood side by side, the eyes of society turned toward them, some with curiosity, others with judgment. She could feel their gaze like a weight upon her, their whispers slicing through the air like 1,000 blades. She smiled, of course, as was expected of her, but the smile felt hollow, like an actor playing a role she had not chosen. William remained distant, standing beside her but as far away as if he were a continent apart. His attention was fixed elsewhere on his business associates, the latest fashion trends, the next deal to secure his power and influence. Elizabeth was little more than an accessory, a necessary part of his social standing, and nothing more. Her performance was flawless. She played the role of the dutiful duchess, gracious, poised, and elegant, while her insides twisted with the pain of what she had just committed to. She was now married to a man who would never love her, a man who had made it clear that she was nothing more than a vessel for his title, a woman who would bear him an heir and then fade into the background of his life. The carriage ride to Ashford Hall, William's country estate in Hampshire, was as silent as the marriage itself. The wheels of the carriage creaked as they rolled over the cobblestones, and the only sound between them was the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves. Elizabeth sat across from William, her gaze fixed on the passing streets of London, which slowly gave way to the rolling green hills of the countryside. The silence was oppressive, and Elizabeth's thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and despair. William, on the other hand, was immersed in his own world. He read through documents, occasionally glancing at her but never speaking. His indifference was a stark reminder of how little he thought of her, of how little she mattered in the grand scheme of his life. The journey seemed endless, and the longer they traveled, the more Elizabeth's sense of isolation grew. This was her life now, silence and duty, nothing more. When they finally arrived at Ashford Hall, Elizabeth could not help but feel a shiver of foreboding. The estate was vast and beautiful, its Gothic architecture rising up from the lush grounds like a monument to power and wealth. But despite the beauty, there was an undeniable coldness to the place, as if the very walls were built to guard against warmth, against human connection. As they entered the grand foyer, the staff was lined up to greet them, their expressions polite but distant. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dawson, greeted Elizabeth with kind eyes, but there was an unmistakable air of formality that left no room for warmth. Elizabeth was shown to her chambers separate from William's, of course at the opposite end of the hall. The room was spacious, its stone walls lined with heavy tapestries and dark wood furniture. It was magnificent, but it felt like a prison. As the door clicked shut behind her, Elizabeth sank onto the edge of the bed. She was now the Duchess of Ashford, a woman bound by duty to a man who would never love her. The weight of her new title pressed down on her chest, but it was the silence that overwhelmed her the most. She was alone in a strange, cold house, married to a man who had not once shown her the kindness of a stranger. That evening, after dinner, Elizabeth was called to William's private study. The house was quiet now, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. She entered the study wearing a simple nightgown and wrapper, expecting nothing more than a brief conversation before she retired for the night. But when she saw William standing before the fireplace, still fully dressed, his glass of brandy in hand, she knew something was different. "Come in, Elizabeth," he said, his voice as cold and formal as ever. He didn't look at her as she entered, his gaze fixed on the fire. The room was dark, the shadows cast by the low light of the fire seeming to deepen the distance between them. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "We should establish the terms of this arrangement clearly, Elizabeth," he said, his use of her name still distant and formal. "I married you because I require an heir. My title demands continuity. The Duchy of Ashford has passed from father to son for 12 generations. That line cannot end with me." He paused, taking a slow sip of his brandy before continuing. "You will perform your duty as Duchess. You will manage the household, represent the family in society, and in time, you will bear my son." Elizabeth remained silent, her heart pounding in her chest. She had known this marriage was a cold arrangement, but hearing the words spoken aloud made them all the more real. "When that duty is fulfilled, you may live as you wish discreetly, of course. I will not interfere with your life, and I expect the same courtesy." His eyes met hers, his expression hardening. "I want you to understand why I can offer you nothing more. I loved once Miss Edward Elizabeth. Her name was Rosalind. The story that followed was a tragic one. Rosalind had been his first love, a woman he had adored with everything he had. But their love had been secret, forbidden, and ultimately deadly. Rosalind had become pregnant, and William, young and terrified of the scandal it would cause, had asked her to wait, to be patient while he arranged things properly. But she had died in childbirth, alone and hemorrhaging, while he was away managing estate business. "I vowed at her grave I would never permit myself such weakness again," William continued, his voice breaking with the weight of his grief. "Love destroys, Elizabeth. It makes fools of rational men and corpses of innocent women." He set down his brandy, the glass clinking softly against the wood. "I will not love you. I cannot. It is not cruelty, it is preservation. For both of us." William turned toward the door, his back to her now. "You may rest tonight. I will not trouble you until you are acclimated to your new position." Elizabeth stood frozen in the doorway, not with fear, but with something far more profound: understanding. This man was not a monster, but a man so broken by grief that he had sealed his heart away, convinced that love would only bring destruction. She spoke softly, her voice steady, though her heart ached. "You think this protects me, Your Grace? This distance?" William paused, his hand on the door handle, but he didn't turn around. "You have built a fortress around yourself, but fortresses are prisons too, for both the keeper and the kept." He didn't respond, and after a long moment, he left the study. Elizabeth stood alone, the weight of his words settling heavily upon her. As the fire flickered in the hearth, she made a vow of her own. "I will not beg for your love, William Alfred, but neither will I disappear into silence. You may have married a necessity, but you will come to know a woman." Elizabeth returned to her chamber, her mind whirling. She didn't cry, she was beyond tears. She stood before the mirror, staring at the woman who now wore the title of Duchess. Wife, to a ghost of a man. But she would not fade into the shadows of his grief. She would find a way to live, to exist, and to make him see that she was not a necessity, she was a woman. And this marriage, this cold arrangement, was not the end of her story. It was only the beginning. In the silence of the night, Elizabeth made a promise to herself. Asterisk, I will not be broken. Asterisk. Spring had turned to summer in 1878, and life at Ashford Hall settled into a cold routine. The days passed in silence, and the grand estate, with its soaring spires and vast grounds, became an almost suffocating monument to the distance between Elizabeth and her husband. The heat of the season pressed against the windows, but inside, there was only the persistent chill of unspoken words and unresolved emotions. Elizabeth's mornings began in solitude. She rose early, as she always had, her chambers bathed in the soft light of the rising Sunday. The warmth of the room could not quite thaw the coolness that had settled in her heart. She had breakfast alone, the silence of the grand dining room, a stark contrast to the bustling mornings she had once imagined as the Duchess. William, having already eaten and departed for estate business, was never there. His absence was felt more keenly with each passing day, a void that seemed to grow larger despite his physical presence in the house. The routine was predictable morning correspondence, meetings with Mrs. Dawson about the household matters that Elizabeth was now responsible for. The staff, though respectful, remained distant. They had not yet formed the bond she had hoped for, and she could not help but notice the subtle whispers that followed her wherever she went. In the afternoons, Elizabeth would take walks through the sprawling grounds of Ashford Hall. The gardens, though beautiful, felt like a labyrinth, endless paths of manicured hedges and climbing ivy that seemed to trap her rather than set her free. She would walk for hours, her mind drifting between the responsibilities of her new life and the aching loneliness that crept up on her with each step. The birdsong and rustling leaves did little to ease the weight in her chest. Evenings brought the same cold routine. William would return to the house, and the two would dine together, but conversation was always limited to the practical matters of the estate. "How were the tenants today, Your Grace?" Elizabeth would ask, her voice steady and composed. "Well enough," William would reply, his tone flat, as if the words themselves held no significance. And with that, the silence would settle back between them, the space at the dinner table stretching like an insurmountable divide. No questions about her day, no attempts to engage with her as more than a mere figurehead. She was the Duchess, and that was enough. In those early months, Elizabeth began to understand William's distance. He was not cruel, he was meticulous, almost obsessively so, in ensuring her comfort. Her chambers were furnished with the finest pieces, crystal chandeliers, velvet drapes, and silk-covered furniture, but they were empty, as though designed to impress her rather than to welcome her. Her allowance, which William had ensured was transferred to her personal account, was generous enough to buy half of London. She could have purchased any luxury she desired, but it was all rendered meaningless without someone to share it with. Yet despite the opulence, William never asked about her preferences. He did not inquire about the way she liked her rooms arranged or what colors pleased her eye. He had provided for her needs, but nothing more. Elizabeth began to notice the small, telling signs of his detachment. He would make arrangements for her comfort, setting up meetings with Mrs. Dawson, ensuring she had everything she needed, but he never took the time to learn about her, to ask about her life or her thoughts. His concern was always logistical, never emotional. He was present, but absent, a shadow sharing her house. She had married a man who, though physically there, remained an enigma, locked away behind the fortress of his past. In the midst of her isolation, Elizabeth began to connect with the staff. Mrs. Dawson, the housekeeper, had grown fond of her. The older woman's eyes were kind, and she often took the time to check in on Elizabeth, ensuring that she had everything she needed. But it was the whispers of the staff that told Elizabeth the most. "They say she's kind, our Duchess," one of the footmen had remarked to another in the hallway. "Shame the Duke can't see it." The words stung, but they were not without hope. Elizabeth won the loyalty of the staff through her genuine kindness. She learned their names, asked after their families, and took the time to listen to their concerns. Slowly, they began to warm to her, offering quiet support where William remained indifferent. There was an unspoken belief among the staff. Asterisk, perhaps she'll thaw him yet. But Elizabeth knew better. The distance between herself and William was not something she could change. It was a wall built from years of grief and emotional pain that she could not touch. Yet, she couldn't help but wish that, somehow, she could bridge the gap. She could really see him beneath the cold facade, but it was as though he were too far removed from life itself to notice her at all. The season was in full swing, and Elizabeth found herself dutifully attending balls, operas, and dinner parties with William. They were always seen together, but always apart. As they moved through society, their interactions were limited to the smallest pleasantries. The frozen Duke and his forgotten Duchess, society had begun to call them. It was cruel, but it was also true. Elizabeth played her role flawlessly, gracious, poised, the perfect aristocratic wife. She smiled, greeted their guests with charm, and answered questions about the estate with the confidence expected of her position. Yet inside, the loneliness continued to grow. She was trapped in a gilded cage, her every move watched and scrutinized by society, yet none of it felt real. William, for his part, remained an enigma. He never once showed affection, never once sought her out at these gatherings. He was always polite, always composed, but never more than a distant figure at her side. And as the weeks passed, Elizabeth began to wonder if she would ever matter to him, if she would ever be anything more than a means to an end, a woman who had fulfilled her duty. Mid-July brought a garden party to Ashford Hall. Elizabeth had taken the reins of hosting, managing every detail with care and precision. She greeted guests, poured tea, and ensured that the entertainment flowed smoothly. She was the perfect hostess, playing the part as flawlessly as she had been taught. But beneath the surface, the cracks were starting to show. Lady Pemberton, a woman whose sharp tongue was as well known as her wealth, commented loudly as she sipped her tea. "Such a shame about the Duke. They say he'll never recover from times her asterisk. Poor Duchess, living with a ghost." The words hit Elizabeth like a slap. Her hands tightened around the porcelain teacup, but she said nothing. She had expected the whispers, the judgment, but hearing it spoken so plainly, so publicly, was a different matter altogether. She excused herself from the conversation, her heart racing as she made her way into the rose garden. Once there, she allowed herself a moment of private anguish. She had been holding it together, playing the role that was expected of her, but in that moment, the weight of the situation was too much. The tears didn't come, but her chest felt tight, as though she were suffocating under the weight of it all. She sat on a bench, her hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the roses as if they might offer her some comfort. The fragrant blooms seemed like a cruel reminder of the life she had once imagined. She had dreamt of love, of connection, of a partnership with someone who would care for her. Instead, she had found herself trapped in a marriage where even the simplest of gestures, like a shared glance or a whispered word, seemed impossible. Elizabeth didn't hear William approach. She was lost in her thoughts, her gaze fixed on the delicate petals before her. The rustling of leaves and the sound of footsteps on the gravel path finally drew her attention, and she turned to find William standing a few paces away. He was silent, as always, his eyes locked on her with a strange intensity that made her breath catch. He had been inspecting the grounds, no doubt checking for the perfection that was expected of his estate, but in this moment, there was no distance between them. Elizabeth looked at him, her heart pounding, her thoughts a chaotic swirl of confusion and longing. William, sensing her gaze, turned away before she could speak. He disappeared into the shadows of the garden, leaving Elizabeth with more questions than answers. But something had shifted inside him, something subtle yet undeniable. For the first time, he had looked at her not with the cold indifference he had always shown, but with something else, a flicker of guilt, perhaps, or even the faintest trace of longing. That night, as the house settled into the quiet of the evening, William lay awake in his chamber. His thoughts were not on his business or the estate, but on Elizabeth, her grace, her dignity, the loneliness he had imposed on her. The image of her sitting alone in the rose garden haunted him, and for the first time, he began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. He remembered Rosalind, the love that had once consumed him, but now, for the first time, the memory didn't bring only pain. It brought something else, the recognition that Elizabeth was suffering because of his ghosts. He didn't know what to do with this realization, so he did nothing. But the seed had been planted, and it would grow whether he acknowledged it or not. Meanwhile, Elizabeth lay awake in her own room, the silence of the house pressing in on her. She realized something then. She could not continue living in this half-life. She could not wait for William to notice her, to love her, to see her as more than just a duty. She would not leave him. Duty bound her to him, but she would stop waiting for him to change. She would live her own life, even if it meant finding purpose in a marriage that was never meant to be anything more than a formal arrangement. She would not beg for his love, but neither would she disappear into silence. The summer heat pressed against the windows of Ashford Hall, but inside, the ice remained. Yet Elizabeth had learned something in these months. Ice, given time and pressure, could crack. She would be patient, she would be strong, and she would not be forgotten. The early days of autumn in 1878 brought a crispness to the air at Ashford Hall. The days were still warm enough for the sun to cast golden light across the estate, but the nights were cool, and the first hint of change in the seasons had arrived. It was a time of transition, and William Alfred, ever the pragmatist, saw it as an ideal moment to host a hunting party. "We shall have a gathering this weekend," William announced one morning over breakfast, his voice as indifferent as ever. "The season calls for it, and our neighbors will appreciate the courtesy." Elizabeth glanced up from her plate, meeting his cold, unreadable gaze. She had spent months navigating the rigid boundaries of their marriage, growing accustomed to his formality, his distance, but the thought of hosting a party, of being scrutinized by society, once again filled her with a quiet dread. Yet, as always, she said nothing. "Very well, Your Grace," she replied, her voice composed. It was the closest thing to a compliment he had given her since their wedding. She had done well with the preparations, he had said. The words lingered in her mind, bitter-sweet. The invitations were sent out, and soon the sprawling estate was buzzing with the excitement of aristocratic guests from across England. The men would hunt, of course shooting pheasant and deer across the sprawling grounds. The women would gather in the drawing rooms, sipping tea and gossiping as they waited for the men to return. It was the perfect blend of tradition and spectacle, where the lives of the titled were put on display for the world to see, their every move scrutinized. Elizabeth had been raised for this life, raised to be the perfect duchess, yet with every passing day it felt more like a gilded cage. This party, this gathering, would be no different. She would smile, converse, and endure. But it was becoming increasingly clear that no matter how much she performed, her place beside William would remain a quiet, distant one. By the time the weekend arrived, the estate had been transformed into a hub of activity. Servants scrambled to prepare, tables were laden with extravagant feasts, and a string quartet played in the background to set the tone of elegance. Ashford Hall, with its towering Gothic spires and dark, imposing walls, was the perfect backdrop for the gathering of London's elite. The guests began to arrive, stepping from their carriages with practiced grace. Lord and Lady Pemberton, the Duke of Somerset, and Lord Thomas Ashby, William's friend from university, were among the first to enter the grand hall. The men were eager to talk business and hunt, while the women quickly found their places in the drawing rooms, sitting primly and waiting for the next round of gossip to unfold. Elizabeth performed her role as hostess with practiced perfection, greeting each guest with the poise expected of a duchess. But behind her smile, the whispers were already beginning. "Poor thing, married to a man in love with a corpse," one woman murmured behind her fan. "I hear they barely speak. Separate chambers, separate lives," another remarked, her eyes scanning Elizabeth's every movement. "She's beautiful, though. What a waste," another woman added, her tone dripping with pity. Elizabeth tried to ignore them, maintaining the composure that had been drilled into her since childhood. She had been trained to smile through the judgments, to endure in silence. But inside, the weight of the whispers pressed against her like 1,000 invisible hands. She could feel them, the subtle slights that sliced through the air, each one a reminder that she was trapped in a marriage where her value was measured by her duty, not her heart. As afternoon tea was served in the drawing room, the guests settled into their familiar roles, sipping their tea, discussing the latest fashions, and gossiping about the scandalous news of the day. Elizabeth moved through the room, a perfect picture of the perfect duchess, but her thoughts were far from the conversation around her. Lady Pemberton, ever the provocateur, took a deliberate sip of her tea before speaking. Her voice, though pitched for quiet conversation, carried across the room, cutting through the low murmur of the guests. "Tell me, Your Grace," Lady Pemberton said loudly, her eyes gleaming with malicious amusement. "Is it terribly lonely being married to a monument? I imagine it's like living in a mausoleum, beautiful, but rather dead." The gasp from the other ladies was immediate, their fans fluttering in nervous flutters. Elizabeth's hands tightened on her teacup, the porcelain edges digging into her fingers, but she did not flinch. Lady Pemberton's words, though cruel, were not surprising. She had heard similar comments before, whispers of her marriage to William, of the Duke's inability to show affection. The distance between them was no secret, but hearing it spoken aloud so publicly still cut deeply. With grace, Elizabeth set her teacup down, the delicate china making a soft clink against the saucer. She met Lady Pemberton's gaze with calm eyes, her voice steady despite the storm that raged within her. "Marriage, Lady Pemberton, is what one makes of it," Elizabeth replied, her words sharp with the weight of her restraint. "Some of us have the grace to face challenges quietly, rather than parade our opinions like market gossip." The room fell silent, the women exchanging uncomfortable glances. Lady Pemberton's smile faltered, and the others laughed too loudly, too quickly, as if to cover the tension that had snapped through the air. But Elizabeth had already excused herself, her composure never wavering. "If you'll forgive me, I believe I'll ride," she said, her voice cool, before turning to leave the room. Once outside, Elizabeth ordered her horse saddled. Artemis, a spirited mare with a glossy coat, was known for her speed and agility, but also for her temper. Elizabeth had always found solace in the rhythm of horseback riding, a rare moment when she could escape the walls of Ashford Hall and the oppressive gaze of society. She knew it was against protocol, ladies were never meant to ride alone, especially not during a party. But in that moment, she didn't care. She needed to breathe. She needed to feel alive again, even if only for a few moments. The wind in her hair, the feel of the reins in her hands, the open sky above her, these were the moments when she could forget her role as Duchess, when she could simply be Elizabeth. She rode hard across the estate, the autumn wind whipping through her hair, the scent of fallen leaves and earth filling her lungs. The sound of the horse's hooves pounding against the ground was the only sound that accompanied her, and for the first time in months, she felt a fleeting sense of freedom. But the freedom was short-lived. As Elizabeth rode toward the farthest reaches of the estate, where the forest grew thick and untamed, she was unaware of the poachers in the woods. They were hunting illegally, aiming their guns at deer that roamed across Ashford land. A single gunshot rang out, startling Artemis, who reared up in terror. Elizabeth, an accomplished rider, tried to regain control, but the horse bolted, panicked by the sound of the gunshot. She clung to the reins, trying to calm Artemis, but the horse was too wild, too frightened. Another shot rang out, closer this time, and Artemis stumbled. The mare's hooves slipped on the uneven ground, and Elizabeth was thrown violently. She hit her head on a stone outcropping, her body slamming into fallen timber. The world went black. An hour passed before Elizabeth had not returned. The grooms were concerned, and the alarm was raised. Word spread quickly, and William was informed. He was in his study with Lord Ashby when the news came. "Your Grace, the Duchess, she rode out alone and hasn't returned." The panic that hit him was raw, visceral, and uncontrollable. For the first time in 8 years, William felt fear. It tore through him, shaking him to his core. He abandoned everything, papers, meetings, and his usual detachment, and ordered every man to search. He mounted his horse, his heart thundering in his chest, and rode out to the estate's edge, his mind consumed by the terrifying thought that he might lose her, that he might be too late. It was dusk by the time William found her. Elizabeth lay crumpled by the forest's edge, her riding habit torn and blood seeping from a head wound. The sight of her pale face sent a jolt of fear through him, a terror he had not known in years. His heart raced as he dismounted and rushed to her side. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice breaking as he cradled her in his arms. For a moment, he didn't recognize it as his own. She was so still, so lifeless, that he feared she was already gone. His hands trembled as he checked for a pulse. It was faint, but it was there. "Don't leave me," he whispered again, the words slipping from his lips before he could stop them. The realization hit him with terrifying clarity. He had said it. He had begged her to stay, and he had no idea when it had happened, when he had allowed himself to care this much. He scooped her up in his arms, carrying her back to the house, his heart still racing, refusing to let anyone else touch her. Elizabeth was carried to her chambers, unconscious and bruised. The doctor was summoned from the village, and his diagnosis was grim: concussion, broken ribs, severe bruising. "She needs rest, Your Grace, and prayer. The next few days will tell." William stood at her bedside, staring at her too pale face. The hunting party had been forgotten, and the guests, awkwardly departing, left Ashford Hall in silence. William refused to leave her room. He stood motionless, his mind reeling. He had vowed never to feel again. But watching her lie so still, his own heart beating wildly in his chest, he realized with terrible clarity he had already broken that vow, and he had no idea when it had happened. The room was heavy with silence, broken only by the soft sound of Elizabeth's shallow breathing. William sat in a chair beside her bed, watching her with a stillness that mirrored the coldness of the room. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the walls, the soft crackle of the fire, the only thing offering any warmth. Mrs. Dawson had brought him food, but he hadn't eaten. His stomach churned with a mix of concern, guilt, and something else a-stirring that he couldn't name. "You should rest, Your Grace," Mrs. Dawson had suggested kindly, her voice thick with concern. "You've been here since she arrived. Perhaps a few hours' sleep might do you well." But William had refused, his voice firm. "No, I will stay." He had never been one for indulgence, least of all in his own comfort. His whole life had been built on duty, on maintaining control, on shielding himself from anything that could undo him. But now, sitting in the dimly lit room with Elizabeth lying so still, he realized that everything he had built, every wall, every defense, was crumbling before him. He was no longer in control. His eyes never left her face. As the hours passed, the lines of her features became more familiar to him, too familiar. The curve of her cheek, the delicate arch of her brow, the slight part of her lips as she slept. It was almost as if he were memorizing them, committing them to memory as though they were something worth holding on to. He didn't understand it. How had she become so familiar to him in such a short time? When had he started seeing her differently? When had she stopped being just his wife, his duty, and become something more? His breath caught in his throat, but he quickly swallowed the thought. He was being foolish. He would not allow himself to feel anything for her. He would not. The second night brought more than just the usual quiet. Elizabeth's fever spiked, and she began to thrash restlessly in her bed. Her brow was slick with sweat, and her breathing was shallow, uneven. William stood at the foot of her bed, staring down at her, torn between the impulse to call for the doctor and the desire to remain close, to somehow protect her from the fever that raged within her. The doctor had warned him earlier, the fever must break, or the consequences could be severe. But William could do nothing but watch. He had always felt powerless in the face of illness, a helplessness that reminded him too sharply of the past, of Rosalind's death, of how he had failed her when she needed him most. His heart clenched, but he forced himself to breathe steadily. Asterisk. This is not the same, asterisk, he reminded himself. Asterisk. Elizabeth is not Rosalind. Asterisk. Elizabeth's delirium took hold in the dead of night. Her body writhed against the sheets, her whispers incoherent and frantic. Her hand reached out, grasping at the air as if searching for something, someone. William leaned closer, his heart racing as he tried to make sense of her mutterings. "Don't leave me, please. Don't leave me in the darkness alone," she whispered, her voice trembling with fear. Her fingers curled into empty space, as if she were reaching for something that wasn't there. Without thinking, William reached out, his fingers brushing hers. He had never been one to show physical affection, not since Rosalind, not since he had locked his heart away. But in that moment, something inside him gave way. He took her hand, his grip firm, though tentative, as if the very act of holding her hand might make her real again. Her fingers responded, curling around his with surprising strength, as though she had been waiting for him all along. She quieted then, her body stilling under his touch, her fevered mutterings subsiding into a soft, rhythmic breathing. For the first time in days, the air in the room seemed to settle, and William felt the tension in his chest loosen. The night stretched on, and William didn't let go. His thumb traced the lines of her hand, the gesture soft, almost hesitant. He stayed there, by her side, as though something in him had unlocked something buried deep beneath layers of fear and grief. For 3 days and nights, William remained at her side. He held her hand through the feverish haze, through the quiet moments when she drifted in and out of consciousness. He spoke to her in a voice that was awkward at first, filled with the discomfort of unfamiliarity, but with time, he found himself speaking with growing ease. "I don't know if you can hear me, Elizabeth," he said on the second night, his voice rough with the strain of unspoken emotions. "I don't know if it matters, but I find myself compelled to speak." At first the words were nothing more than fragments, mundane thoughts, passing observations, but as the hours stretched on, the words became more honest, more open than he had ever been in his life. "I never thought I'd say any of this aloud. I never thought I'd let anyone see this side of me. But here we are." He paused, watching her face for any sign of recognition. "When Rosalind died, I shut myself off from everything, from feeling, from caring. I thought if I felt nothing, I could protect myself, and I thought I could protect others too. But I was wrong." William's voice trembled slightly, though he had not intended it. The confession came with a weight he had carried for 8 years. He spoke of his childhood, of the cold, duty-driven upbringing that had shaped him into the man he was. His parents had taught him that duty came first, above all else, even love. There had never been room for affection or warmth in their household, and when Rosalind had come into his life, he had been too afraid of losing control to truly embrace the love she offered him. "I thought I was protecting myself, but I was only building walls, and now I realize I've kept everyone out, even you." He paused again, his eyes tracing the lines of her face as if searching for any hint of recognition. His thumb continued its gentle movement over her hand, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to pull away. "You asked me once if my fortress protected you," he murmured softly. "It doesn't. It only imprisoned us both, and I've let it go on far too long." It was on the third night that William's composure finally cracked. The room was dark, the fire barely a flicker in the hearth, and the only sound was the soft rustle of Elizabeth's sheets as she slept restlessly. William sat beside her, his head bowed, his fingers still wrapped around hers. The weight of the past hung heavy in the air, and for the first time since Rosalind's death, William allowed himself to feel the crushing weight of his own guilt. "Don't leave me," he whispered, his voice barely audible, breaking the silence that had held them captive for so long. His forehead pressed to their clasped hands, his heart pounding in his chest. "I know I have no right to ask. I have given you nothing but coldness. But please stay." A single tear slipped down his cheek, the first tear he had shed in 8 years. He hadn't even realized it was coming. He had vowed never to feel again, never to be vulnerable, never to allow himself to care for anyone. But with Elizabeth, the walls had cracked, and in the quiet of the night, he felt the full force of his own emotional turmoil. "I don't know what this is. I don't know if I can even call it," he faltered, his voice breaking. "But losing you would destroy me." The words hung in the air like a confession, a promise, a plea. For the first time in years, William allowed himself to acknowledge the depth of his feelings, feelings that had been buried beneath layers of grief and fear. And in that moment, he realized how truly lost he had been, how he had spent so long running from the one thing that could have healed him. The dawn of the fourth day brought a flicker of hope. Elizabeth's eyes fluttered open, her vision blurry, her head throbbing painfully. She tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through her ribs, and she winced, her breath shallow. The first thing she saw was a figure slumped in a chair beside her bed, his hand still holding hers. William. His dark hair was tousled, his shirt wrinkled, and his face was haggard with exhaustion. But his presence was a relief, a balm to her frazzled mind. "William?" Her voice was barely a whisper, a crack in the silence. He jerked awake, his eyes wild with hope and fear. His gaze locked onto hers, and without a word, he leaned forward, tightening his grip on her hand as if afraid she might slip away again. "Elizabeth," he whispered, his voice hoarse with emotion. "You came back." Elizabeth tried to sit up, but the pain in her ribs made it impossible. William was quick to press her back down gently, his hands tender as he supported her. "Don't move. You're badly hurt," he said softly, his voice filled with concern. She stared at him, really looked at him for the first time since the accident. The exhaustion in his eyes, the care in his touch. It was something she had never seen from him before. Something had changed. "How long?" she asked, her voice hoarse. 3 days, he replied, his voice thick with emotion. Her eyes widened. "You've been here?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I couldn't leave." In that moment, something shifted. The distance that had always existed between them, so vast, so impenetrable, seemed to vanish. And in its place, there was a fragile understanding, a recognition of the vulnerability they had both been hiding. Elizabeth saw something in his eyes she had never seen before: vulnerability, fear, and dare she hope something that looked almost like tenderness. "William, she didn't know how to finish the sentence. Words felt insufficient. He shook his head, his gaze softening. "Rest now. We'll talk when you're stronger." But even as he spoke, he didn't let go of her hand, and Elizabeth didn't ask him to. Over the following days, Elizabeth's strength began to return. Her ribs still ached, and she was still too weak to move much. But with William by her side, something inside her began to heal. He remained close, reading to her in the afternoons poetry, novels, whatever she requested. Their conversations were no longer about formalities or duties, but about small, personal things: the estate, the tenants, books they had read, places they had traveled. For the first time, they spoke as people, not just as husband and wife bound by duty. Elizabeth discovered that William was intelligent, well-read, and surprisingly, even occasionally witty. William, in turn, learned that Elizabeth was perceptive, strong, and remarkably forgiving. One afternoon, Elizabeth woke from a nap to find William sitting by the window, watching her, not reading, not working, just watching her. When their eyes met, something passed between them, unspoken, undeniable. Elizabeth's heart began to race, but it wasn't from the injury. It was something else. William stood abruptly, almost fleeing. "I should let you rest," he muttered, avoiding her gaze. But as he left the room, Elizabeth touched her chest, feeling her thundering heart. "Oh no," she whispered. "I'm falling in love with him." Elizabeth was strong enough to walk now, though her ribs still ached. She stood at her window, watching William ride across the estate, his figure distant yet somehow more familiar than ever before. She remembered his words during her delirium. She had heard them, floating in and out of consciousness. "Don't leave me." And as she watched him, the realization settled into her bones. He was afraid, not of loving her, but of admitting it to himself. The accident had broken more than her ribs. It had cracked the ice around William's heart. And Elizabeth, despite every promise she'd made to protect herself, found herself hoping that the thaw would continue, even if it meant risking her own heart in the process. 2 weeks had passed since the accident, and Elizabeth was slowly recovering. The pain in her ribs still lingered, and she had yet to regain her full strength, but the worst was behind her. Life at Ashford Hall had settled into an almost unnatural calm. The estate, once filled with the bustling of servants and the murmurs of guests, now felt like a hushed monument, a house whose walls had absorbed the tension between its inhabitants. But something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable. William no longer maintained the rigid distance he had kept for so long. There were small touches now, touches that, though fleeting, seemed to linger longer than they should. His hand, for instance, would rest at her elbow when guiding her through a doorway. It was only for a moment, yet the warmth of it would travel through her like an electric current. There were glances across the dinner table, moments when their eyes would meet, and for a split second, Elizabeth would catch her breath. There was no malice in these touches, no coldness, but something else, a tension that was neither comfortable nor painful, just times alive asterisk. She could feel it too, the undeniable pull between them that neither of them dared to acknowledge. It wasn't hostility. No, it was far more complicated than that. It was the space between what they were, what they had been, and what they could be. A space filled with everything they had left unsaid. As autumn deepened, it was time to return to London. The season, though in its later stages, still held enough significance to demand their attendance. Ashford House in Grosvenor Square would once again be their home, a place where the eyes of society would scrutinize them from every corner. The return to the city was inevitable, and with it came the whispers. The moment they stepped foot into the familiar drawing room of Ashford House, society took note. It was subtle at first, the way William looked at her, not with the usual coldness, but with a flicker of something more, something times human asterisk. The way he spoke to her with more attention, with something resembling care. "Have you seen them?" one lady whispered at the opera. "The Duke actually looks at her." "I saw him smile just slightly when she spoke. I nearly fainted," another remarked, her voice dripping with excitement. The whispers, once filled with pity, had started to shift into something else, speculation. The eyes that once saw Elizabeth as a ghost, a woman trapped in an emotionless marriage, now wondered if there was something more between her and the Duke, something not so easily dismissed. One of the grand events of the season was the opera at Covent Garden, La Traviata, a tale of love, loss, and the relentless passage of time, would be the perfect setting for their re-entry into society. Elizabeth wore a gown of deep sapphire silk, the color rich and regal, complemented by sapphires at her throat, gifts from William, given without ceremony, but chosen with care. She knew the gesture wasn't an attempt at affection, but rather another offering to ensure her place in the world he controlled. And yet, as she dressed, she felt a flicker of something warm, something that might have been gratitude or perhaps a longing for something she couldn't name. They sat in the Ashford box, the most coveted seat in the house, visible to all of London. The performance began, but Elizabeth found herself distracted by something more than the music. She leaned forward slightly, captivated by the aria that filled the hall, her expression softening, her eyes bright with the intensity of the emotion. William, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, was not watching the stage. His gaze was fixed on her. The way the gaslight caught her profile, the way the music seemed to touch her soul, it was a side of her he had never truly noticed before, a side he had always chosen to ignore. His hand rested lightly on the edge of her chair, just inches from her shoulder, and Elizabeth could feel the heat of his presence, the barely there brush of his fingers against her gown. For a brief, fleeting moment, neither of them moved, neither of them pulled away. The evening passed in a blur of music, laughter, and the subtle electric tension between them. After the opera, they returned to Ashford House, the streets of London growing quieter as they neared the familiar grandeur of their residence. They were the last to arrive, and the servants had already retired for the night. The house was still, the air thick with expectation. Elizabeth stood in the entrance hall, her heart still racing from the performance, from the moments shared between her and William. She turned to him, her voice soft as she spoke. "Thank you for tonight. I love the opera." William paused, his gaze lingering on her. "I know," he replied, his voice quieter than usual. "You smile differently when the music moves you." Surprised, she looked up at him. "You noticed?" "I notice everything about you, Elizabeth." The admission hung between them, charged with an unspoken understanding. For a moment, neither of them moved, and Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. William stepped closer, so close that she could feel his breath against her skin, his presence enveloping her. His hand reached toward her face, his fingers hovering just inches from her cheek. In that brief, suspended moment, Elizabeth thought he might kiss her. She closed her eyes, waiting for the touch, the spark that would change everything. But then, with an almost imperceptible shift, he stepped back. "Good night, Elizabeth," he murmured, his voice strained. Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the silence. Elizabeth stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. The tension between them had reached its peak, and in the blink of an eye, it had shattered, leaving her standing alone, trembling, aching with want. That night, Elizabeth paced her chamber, her mind a chaotic whirlwind of confusion and longing. She had felt it, the near kiss, the crack in the wall he had built around himself, but it was not enough. Not nearly enough. He had come so close, and yet he had stopped, pulling away before anything could change. She knew the truth now. She was falling in love with him, completely, irrevocably in love with her husband. But what was he feeling? He still clung to his vow, his fear, his past. He still kept her at arm's length, still refused to acknowledge the pull between them. Should she pursue him? Wait? Protect herself from the inevitable heartbreak? She didn't know. She truly didn't know. Her maid, Sarah, entered the room, noticing her unrest. "Are you well, Your Grace?" Elizabeth stopped, her chest tight. She smiled weakly. "I don't know, Sarah. I truly don't know." William, too, struggled in silence. That night, in his study, he poured himself a glass of brandy, his hands shaking slightly as he lifted the glass to his lips. He had almost kissed her. He had wanted to, desperately. But Rosalind's ghost, always there, always whispering, held him back. "You destroyed me," she seemed to say. "You'll destroy her too." He downed the brandy, poured another, and downed that too. His mind raced, his thoughts tangled between the woman in his bed and the woman he had lost. But deep down, he knew he could not continue like this. He was suffocating, and so was Elizabeth. Lord Ashby visited him the next morning, finding him uncharacteristically disheveled. "You're in love with her," Ashby said bluntly, his voice cutting through the tension that had settled over William. "I can't be," William replied, his voice hoarse. "Why? Because you vowed never to feel again. That's the stupidest thing I've ever heard you say, William, and you've said some remarkably stupid things." William's eyes darkened. "I'll hurt her. I hurt everyone I love." "You're hurting her now," Ashby shot back, "with this distance." A week later, the Countess of Montrose's ball took place. It was the event of the season, 500 guests from every corner of society. Elizabeth wore a gown of emerald green, the color vibrant against her porcelain skin. The diamonds she wore had been passed down through generations, a family heirloom, but they felt heavy now, like a reminder of the marriage she was trapped in. William could barely look away from her. She was breathtaking. They danced, for the first time since their wedding. A waltz, slow, intimate, and fraught with unspoken tension. His hand rested at her waist, hers on his shoulder. They moved in perfect synchronization, but the space between them was palpable. "You dance beautifully," he murmured. "So do you. I didn't know. You never asked. You never offered." There was a pause, and then, almost as if he had been waiting for the right moment, he spoke again. "I'm offering now, Elizabeth, for whatever that's worth." Her heart skipped a beat. "What are you offering, William?" He didn't answer, couldn't answer. The music ended, and they parted, but something had been said even in the silence. Later that night, Lord Ashby asked Elizabeth to dance. William watched from the sidelines, his jaw tight as Ashby charmed her with his usual ease. Elizabeth laughed genuinely, her eyes sparkling in a way that William had never seen before. A feeling surged within him, something unfamiliar and violent, jealousy. It was possessive, irrational, and pure. When the dance ended, William was there immediately. "My wife needs refreshment," he said, his tone brooking no argument. Ashby grinned knowingly. "Of course, Your Grace." William escorted Elizabeth to the terrace, away from the prying eyes of the ballroom. The cool November air was a welcome relief, but the tension between them was palpable. "Are you well?" Elizabeth asked, sensing something off in his demeanor. "You seem jealous," William finished, his voice harsh. Her eyes widened. "Of Ashby? Of any man who makes you smile, which is absurd, I know. I have no right." "William." "I broke my vow, Elizabeth." The words spilled out of him, raw and unfiltered. "I told you I would never love you. I've broken that vow so thoroughly I can barely remember making it." Elizabeth's heart stopped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that watching you nearly die destroyed me. I'm saying that every moment since, I've been trying to resist something inevitable. I'm saying—" A noise from the ballroom interrupted them, and the moment shattered. They returned inside, nothing resolved, but everything changed. That night, Elizabeth couldn't sleep. He had almost said it, almost confessed, but almost was torture. She realized she couldn't continue in this limbo. Either he committed to this marriage truly, or she must find a way to survive without hope. The fog pressed against the windows of Ashford House, thick and suffocating. Inside, desire and denial warred in silence. The ice had cracked, but would William allow it to melt completely? Or would he forge new walls, higher and colder than before? Elizabeth didn't know, but she knew she couldn't wait forever. Something had to break. It was a chilly December morning when Elizabeth sat in the drawing room at Ashford House, sipping her morning tea. The low hum of activity in the house was familiar to her now, servants bustling about, the soft scrape of footsteps in the hallway, the occasional murmur of a distant conversation. It had been a few weeks since their return from Ashford Hall, and the house had settled into its usual rhythm. Elizabeth, still recovering from her accident, had been steadily resuming her duties, though she had yet to regain her full strength. The weight of her marriage and the delicate balance of her life with William still hung over her, but for the first time, she had begun to find solace in her daily routine. The stillness of the morning was interrupted by the sharp sound of the butler's voice, announcing, "Lady Constance Hartley." Elizabeth froze. The name struck her like a bolt of lightning. Rosalind's sister. She had heard whispers of Constance over the years, the woman who had once been William's great love, the woman whose memory had cast a shadow over their marriage. A woman who, by all accounts, had never quite let go of the past. Her pulse quickened as Constance entered the room. She was beautiful, her mourning attire still black after all these years, though the fashionable cut of her gown indicated that she had not forsaken society's standards. Constance's eyes, sharp and calculating, flickered over Elizabeth before settling on her with a practiced smile. "Your Grace, how kind of you to receive me," Constance said, her voice smooth, but with an underlying edge. Elizabeth's instinct screamed at her. This woman was dangerous. Elizabeth rose from her chair, her gaze steady but her stomach tight. "Of course, Lady Constance. It's a pleasure." Constance's smile didn't reach her eyes. Instead, it lingered with a hint of something more, something Elizabeth couldn't quite place but immediately knew she didn't trust. They sat in silence for a moment, the tea poured, the clink of the porcelain cups filling the space between them. Elizabeth's fingers wrapped carefully around her teacup, her mind racing. She had heard the stories about Constance, how she had never quite let go of William's memory, how she had tormented him from the shadows of his grief. But hearing it from the woman herself, it was an entirely different matter. "You're lovelier than I expected," Constance remarked, her voice casual, but the words like daggers. "I suppose that's why he chose you." Elizabeth set down her teacup, her hand steady despite the tremor that ran through her. "I'm sure I don't understand, Lady Constance." "Oh, I think you do," Constance replied, her smile turning cruel. "My sister was beautiful, too. It didn't save her." Elizabeth's blood ran cold at the implication. She had heard of the tragic circumstances surrounding Rosalind's death, but hearing it spoken so plainly by this woman, this sister who had lost everything, there was a chill in the air now, one that had nothing to do with the cold December wind. "I know about Rosalind," Elizabeth said quietly, her gaze never leaving Constance's. "William told me." Constance's eyes glinted with something that might have been amusement. "Did he? How? Trusting of him." She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice. "Tell me, did he share all the details?" Elizabeth's stomach churned. Her worst suspicions about Constance's motives were beginning to take shape. The woman was here not to mourn a lost sister, but to stir up something far darker, something designed to tear open the wounds William had fought so long to bury. Constance's smile faded, replaced by a calculated look as she continued. "My sister died giving birth to his child. A child conceived in secret, out of wedlock. He was young, she was reckless, and they were in love, or so Rosalind believed." Elizabeth's heart thudded painfully against her chest. The words hit her like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain composed. When she told him about the baby, he panicked. His father was alive then, a tyrant who would have disowned him for such a scandal. So William told her to wait, to hide it, and he would arrange things properly. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as the cruel story unfolded. She had known of the tragic end, but this revelation about the child, the abandonment, sounded more like betrayal than tragedy. "But he didn't," Constance continued, her voice growing colder, harder. "He left her alone in a cottage on the estate, hidden away like shameful rubbish. When she went into labor, she was attended by only a midwife, not even a proper doctor. She hemorrhaged. She died. She called for him. She died calling his name. And William? He was in London, managing estate business, pretending she didn't exist." The room seemed to tilt as Elizabeth's blood ran cold. The man she had come to care for, had she truly come to love, was a man who had abandoned a woman in her time of need, who had left her to die alone while he carried on with his duties, his reputation. Elizabeth's hand clenched into a fist on the armrest of her chair. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice calm, though her insides felt as though they were being torn apart. Constance's mask dropped entirely then, revealing her true intentions. "Because I want you to know what he is," she spat, her words laced with venom. "A coward who lets women die to protect himself." Constance stood, preparing to leave, the last words hanging between them like a poison. "I've told you as a courtesy, Your Grace, because I'm going to tell all of London unless William pays me what I'm owed." "What you're owed?" Elizabeth asked, her voice a whisper, but her mind racing. £10,000, Constance replied smoothly, as if this were the most casual conversation. "For my silence. I've been collecting from him for years. Did you not wonder where his money goes? But I've grown tired of small payments. I want the full sum. By the end of the week." Elizabeth's mind spun. "And if he doesn't pay?" "Then at the Devonshire masquerade on Friday, I will ensure everyone knows the truth. The Duke's first love, pregnant and abandoned, dead because of his cowardice. Society will devour him. And you, dear Duchess, will be married to a pariah." The weight of her words hit Elizabeth like a slap, but she refused to show her shock. Instead, she rose from her chair, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "You won't succeed," she said, her eyes narrowing. "You won't destroy him, not while I stand by him." After Constance left, Elizabeth felt the ground shift beneath her. She had to understand. She had to see the truth for herself. William was out, meeting with his solicitors, and Elizabeth took the opportunity to visit his private study. She had never entered it before, his domain, his fortress, but now she had to see for herself what had been hidden. She moved quickly, but with purpose, searching through his desk. There, in the drawers, she found a collection of bank drafts, payments made to Constance over the years, small amounts here and there, £500, £1,000, always marked as personal debt. But then she found something else, a drawer locked tight, but with the key sitting, unnoticed, on the desk. She hesitated for only a moment before unlocking it. Inside, she found letters that shouldn't have been there. The letters were from Rosalind to William, written before her death. Elizabeth should not have read them, she knew that. But something inside her compelled her to understand. What had really happened? What had William kept hidden? As she read, the truth began to unfold. Rosalind had been aware of William's fear, of his inability to act, but she had never blamed him. The final letter, written just days before Rosalind's death, was the hardest to read. Asterisk, "My dearest William, I do not blame you for this. Society has made cowards of us all. If I do not survive this, please know, I loved you, and I forgive you. Do not let guilt destroy you. Live, William, live for both of us." Asterisk. The tears came then, but they were not for Rosalind. They were for William, for the pain he had endured, for the love he had lost and never truly healed from. But now it was clear. Constance had been exploiting that guilt for years. Rosalind had forgiven him, but William had never forgiven himself. And now Constance was threatening to destroy him publicly, to use his guilt as a weapon. Elizabeth couldn't let that happen. That evening, when William returned home, Elizabeth was waiting for him in his study. The tension between them was palpable as she rose to face him. "We need to talk about Lady Constance," she said, her voice steady but filled with determination. William's face paled. "She came here? She told me everything. About Rosalind, about the baby, about the blackmail. See?" His shoulders slumped in defeat, and for the first time, Elizabeth saw him as he truly was, broken, vulnerable. "Now you know what I am," he said quietly. Elizabeth stepped closer to him. "Yes, I know. You were a frightened young man who made a terrible mistake. I know you've been punishing yourself for 8 years. I know you've been paying Constance blackmail to keep her silent, but I also know, because I read Rosalind's letters, that she forgave you. Intensive." William staggered backward, gripping the edge of his desk. "You read. Those were private." "They were," Elizabeth said, her voice soft, "but I needed to understand." She read aloud the final letter from Rosalind. "My dearest William, I do not blame you for this. Society has made cowards of us all. If I do not survive this, please know, I loved you, and I forgive you. Do not let guilt destroy you. Live, William, live for both of us." William collapsed into a chair, his face crumpling with grief. I've spent 8 years telling myself I didn't deserve to be happy, that living fully would be a betrayal of her memory. And now? Elizabeth asked quietly. Now I realize I've betrayed her memory far more by refusing to live at all. She begged me to live, and I chose to become a ghost. Elizabeth explained Constance's ultimatum, £10,000 by Friday, or public exposure at the Devonshire masquerade. William's first instinct was to pay. I'll pay it. I'll pay whatever she demands. No, Elizabeth said firmly. You won't. But the scandal. I understand perfectly. Constance has been extorting you for years, and you've let her because you believe you deserve punishment. But this ends, not with money, with truth. Elizabeth outlined her strategy. We don't hide anymore. We tell our story, your story, before she can weaponize it. William recoiled. At the Devonshire masquerade? In front of all of London? Yes, Elizabeth said firmly. At the Devonshire masquerade, we tell the truth. We speak as equals, as husband and wife. William wanted to refuse, but he couldn't. He knew she was right. You're right, he whispered. This ends now. The night before the ball, they prepared. Elizabeth wrote and rewrote her speech, reading passages to William, refining the language. William practiced hearing the truth spoken aloud, and with each practice, the weight of the past seemed to loosen. The morning of the ball came, and they were ready. Tomorrow, everything will change, Elizabeth thought, her heart racing. William will finally be forced to choose, and I will stand by him, no matter the outcome. No come to other life past. Friday arrived with brutal clarity, the night of the Devonshire masquerade, the grand event of the season. London's elite would gather at the Countess of Montrose's magnificent estate, a glittering affair where masks and costumes would allow for anonymity, yet society's most watchful eyes would be in full force. 500 of the most influential people in London would be present, and for the first time in months, Elizabeth was about to step into the public eye, not as a duty-bound wife, but as someone with a purpose William had shared with her and which she was now prepared to fulfill. The anticipation was suffocating, but there was no turning back. The blackmail was in motion, Constance's threat looming over them like a storm cloud, but tonight Elizabeth would make sure the storm did not break them. She would speak the truth, and in doing so, she would finally free them both. Her heart beat with a mix of fear and exhilaration. This wasn't just about her marriage anymore, it was about their lives, their freedom from the shackles of the past. As she dressed for the ball, Elizabeth chose her attire with deliberate care. A Venetian mask of silver and midnight blue, adorned with sapphires to match her eyes, would conceal her identity while also making a statement. Her gown, a rich midnight blue silk, cascaded like water around her form, elegant and powerful. When she stood before the mirror, the reflection staring back at her seemed like someone else, someone fierce, ready for battle. She looked like a warrior queen, not a frightened woman standing beside a man who could barely look at her. When she descended the staircase, William was waiting at the bottom, his eyes fixed on her. He had chosen his own costume, black and silver, a striking mask with a single emerald gleaming at its center. They looked like partners, not a disconnected couple. They were united for purpose, and in this moment, that was enough. "You're magnificent," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and something softer, something she had rarely heard from him. "I know," Elizabeth replied with a slight smile. "Today, I need to be." They shared a brief look, and in that shared glance, Elizabeth knew this was more than just an event. It was a reckoning for both of them. The carriage ride through London's gaslit streets felt like a dream. The rhythm of the wheels against the cobblestones seemed to match the frantic beating of Elizabeth's heart. She sat closer to William than she ever had before, an unspoken unity between them that hadn't existed in the past. It was the first time in their marriage that the distance between them felt less like a chasm and more like a shared space charged with the electricity of anticipation, but not the coldness of separation. William, still ever the Duke, had not shown his true feelings, but there was a subtle shift in him. He reached over, his fingers brushing against her gloves. Without thinking, he gently pulled one off, bringing her bare hand to his lips. It was a quiet gesture, but for Elizabeth it was enough. It was a gesture of gratitude, of alliance, of something deeper that didn't need words. "Whatever happens tonight," William said softly, his voice low but filled with meaning, "thank you for fighting for us." Elizabeth didn't respond. She simply interlaced her fingers with his and held tight. Her heart raced, but not out of fear. There was something else now, something she hadn't dared hope for. They were in this together, for better or worse. When they arrived at Devonshire House, the grandeur of the estate took her breath away. The sprawling grounds, the towering columns, the shimmering lights from the ballroom windows, it was all overwhelming. But for the first time, Elizabeth wasn't afraid. Tonight, she would be heard. She would stand beside William, not as a silent observer, but as a force in her own right. "Ready?" William asked, his eyes searching hers. "No," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor of anticipation. "But I'm doing it anyway." Inside the ballroom, the spectacle was beyond anything Elizabeth had imagined. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured light across the room, and the air was thick with the perfume of flowers that seemed to be cascading from every surface. The orchestra played a delicate waltz, its melodies intermingling with the soft murmur of society's most powerful figures. The guests danced and mingled, masked and elegant, but beneath the beauty of the evening was something far darker, an undercurrent of judgment, of whispered conversations, of deals being made behind the velvet curtains. William and Elizabeth entered together, a matched pair moving with purpose. They were a striking contrast to the usual high society spectacle, united, focused, and undeniably in control. As they moved through the room, the whispers began. "The Duke smiles. Do you see it?" one woman whispered to another. "No, but look at how he watches her." It wasn't pity anymore. It wasn't the whispered judgments of a marriage in ruins. It was curiosity, speculation, even. The room had begun to shift, and now there was a question on everyone's lips. Asterisk. What had changed? Asterisk. By 10 o'clock, Lady Constance Hartley made her entrance. Dressed in emerald silk, her mask a sleek cat design adorned with diamonds, she moved through the crowd with the confidence of a predator stalking its prey. She made a beeline for William, finding him standing on a side terrace, away from the throngs of guests. She smiled, her eyes flashing with a calculated coldness. "Your Grace, how punctual of you to attend," she said, her voice dripping with mock sweetness. "I do hope you've brought the money." William's voice was steady, almost calm. "I haven't, but I have something better. A confession." Constance's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, her eyes narrowing. How dramatic, and how utterly foolish. "Perhaps," William replied evenly, "or perhaps brave." At William's subtle gesture, a servant moved to pass on the prearranged signal to the orchestra. The music shifted, swelling in volume and intensity. The guests froze for a moment, looking toward the grand staircase. The atmosphere in the room shifted. Everything was about to change. Elizabeth, waiting in an antechamber just off the ballroom, received word through Mrs. Dawson. It was time. A dramatic fanfare cut through the music, stopping all dancing and conversation. Eyes turned toward the grand staircase as Elizabeth appeared at the top, her midnight blue gown flowing behind her like a shadow, her silver and sapphire mask gleaming in the candlelight. The Duchess of Ashford was about to speak, and in that moment she commanded the room. Every pair of eyes was on her. The power, the confidence in her presence was palpable. She descended slowly, deliberately, each step echoing in the silence that had descended. At the bottom, William waited, offering his hand to her. She took it, standing at his side, the two of them united in purpose. The whispers fell silent. The game was changing. Elizabeth's voice rang out clear and strong, carrying to every corner of the room. There was no hesitation, no fear, only the quiet strength of a woman who had nothing left to hide. "I have an announcement to make," she began, her voice smooth, controlled, not as the Duchess, but as a woman who has come to know the truth about a tragedy that has haunted my husband for 8 years. A hush fell over the room. The crowd's attention was rapt, as if they had been waiting for this moment. Lady Rosalind Hartley was beloved. She was kind, passionate, and tragically unprepared for the choices society forced upon her and upon my husband. Elizabeth's gaze swept across the room, her eyes hardening as she continued. 8 years ago, my husband loved a woman. He was young, only 20 when he met her. She was 22. They fell in love in the way young people do, completely and dangerously. But their love was forbidden. Her father and his father were political enemies. Marriage was impossible. Society would have destroyed them both. She paused, allowing the weight of the words to settle over the room. They conducted their affair in secret, and Rosalind became pregnant. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. When she told William, he faced an impossible choice: acknowledge the child and be disowned by his father, or ask her to wait while he figured out a way to handle it quietly. Elizabeth's voice softened. He chose the latter. He was afraid. He was young. He was unprepared for the weight of what his love had created. She glanced at William, then back at the crowd. Rosalind went into hiding on the Ashford estate, attended only by a midwife. William arranged for her care and made plans to acknowledge the child and marry her quietly. But she died in childbirth. She hemorrhaged, and there was nothing anyone could do. She died calling his name, and my husband was not there because he was in London managing estate business, trying to arrange the financial settlements that would have made their marriage possible. The room was silent, the weight of the tragedy settling over them. What happened between them was not scandal, Elizabeth continued, her voice steady. It was heartbreak born from an impossible world that demanded both love and denial simultaneously. My husband has spent 8 years atoning for choices he made as a frightened young man. He has lived like a ghost, believing he didn't deserve to be happy. She reached over and took William's hand, linking her fingers with his. But tonight I am here to tell you this. Society loved my husband's pain. It was exotic, tragic, worth gossiping about over tea. She turned her gaze toward Constance, her eyes sharp. And one woman in particular has profited from it. Elizabeth's voice became sharper, more commanding. Lady Constance Hartley is Rosalind's sister, and for 5 years she has been extorting my husband. Constance's face drained of color. She made an attempt to move, but servants had subtly positioned themselves at her exit. The game was over. She threatened to expose the tragedy of Rosalind's death unless William paid her vast sums of money. Elizabeth produced bank drafts from her reticule documents, showing years of payments to Constance. My husband paid to keep his pain private. He believed he deserved the punishment of secrecy, but I will not allow him to pay one more penny to a woman who profits from tragedy. She turned to face Constance directly, her gaze fierce. You do not get to weaponize grief. You do not get to bleed a man for his guilt. You do not get to use your sister's memory as a tool of extortion. Your sister forgave him. I have forgiven him. The only person who cannot forgive him is you, because forgiveness would mean you couldn't continue to profit from his pain. Constance tried to maintain her composure, but her voice trembled with fury. This is absurd. Your Grace is clearly hysterical, reading from false documents. I am the grieving sister of a tragedy. Everything I did was... A voice cut through the noise. Lady Constance, I'm afraid the documents are quite authentic. Lord Ashby stepped forward, holding a sheaf of papers. He read aloud one particularly damning letter, a letter of extortion from Constance, demanding payment from William, threatening to expose the truth about Rosalind's death. The crowd shifted uneasily. The elegant sympathy that had been extended to Constance evaporated, replaced with disgust. Blackmail, a duchess whispered loudly. How utterly beyond the pale. Extortion of a peer? She'll face charges, another murmured. Elizabeth stood tall, her voice cutting through the whispers. I won't let this go on any longer. Constance, defeated and humiliated, made her way toward the exit. The staff parted to let her pass, but the whispers of society followed her every step. The music resumed, and as if by instinct, William reached for Elizabeth's hand. Without hesitation, she took it, and together they moved to the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted, and as they danced, Elizabeth felt the shift in the air. The tension had finally broken. I'm free, William murmured, his voice filled with awe. I feel free. Later, in the quiet alcove of the ballroom, William turned to Elizabeth, his eyes soft with gratitude. I don't know how to thank you, he said quietly. You've given me more than I ever thought I deserved. Elizabeth smiled, her heart full. You've already given me what I needed. You're not a ghost anymore, William, and neither am I. The ice had shattered, and for the first time, They were free. The night ended with the music still swirling in the air, but for William and Elizabeth, everything had changed. The ghosts of the past had been faced, and together they had found something more important than society's judgment: the freedom to live, to love, and to be seen, truly, for who they were. The days following the Devonshire masquerade were filled with the kind of frantic energy that only London society could muster. Gossip spread like wildfire through the city, its flames consuming everyone who had been involved in the scandal. But as the gossip shifted from pity to celebration, as the whispers turned into admiring glances, Elizabeth began to notice something more subtle. Something had changed in William. The Duke and Duchess of Ashford were no longer the tragic couple, the pair who had been pitied by all. Now, they were the subject of admiration, the very embodiment of redemption. Invitations flooded in from every corner of society, each note an eager summons to see them, to talk to them, to bask in the scandal-turned redemption. They were no longer the broken duo in the eyes of the ton, but a success story, one that proved the power of truth and public confession. Yet, in the privacy of their home, something else was happening. William had withdrawn again, retreating into the shadow of his past. Elizabeth noticed it in the stillness of their mornings and the solitude of his rides. He had made his confession, exposed the deepest parts of himself to society, and accepted their judgments. But privately, he was struggling. He was caught between the joy of his newfound freedom and the terror that came with it. What did it mean to be free? To live without the weight of guilt? He oscillated between these emotions, unsure of how to reconcile the man he had been with the man he now wanted to be. The days stretched on, and William spent more and more time away from the house, riding across the estate alone, seeking solitude. Elizabeth didn't press him. She had learned to give him space when he needed it. She watched him, though, his eyes growing haunted as the days went by. She understood. His love for her was still tangled up with his fear, and fear, as always, was the thing that controlled him. William's retreat was not as cold as before, but it was just as isolating. He had begun to spend long hours alone in his study or out on the estate, wandering the grounds in search of something he couldn't find. His eyes grew darker with each passing day, as if he were searching for answers in the wind or in the trees, answers that never came. Elizabeth could sense his internal battle. He had broken down his walls in front of her once, but now they seemed to be building again, higher than before. He had confessed his love, but did he believe it? Did he truly understand what it meant to love without the fear of loss? In the evenings, William would return, exhausted, but still distant. He would sit in silence across from her at dinner, and though his eyes would occasionally flicker to hers, they never lingered long enough for her to feel truly seen. She knew it was not out of malice, it was his fear, still gripping him tightly, still preventing him from stepping fully into the light. For Elizabeth, the distance was maddening. She had thought that the confession at the masquerade would be the beginning of something new, something honest, something whole. But now, she felt as though she was standing at the edge of a cliff, waiting for him to take the final step toward her, while he remained rooted in place, unwilling to move. William's internal battle was not something he could express easily. The terror he felt about loving her was a silent ache that gnawed at him constantly. He had spent years building walls, convincing himself that love was something that would only lead to pain. The death of Rosalind had cemented that belief. He had vowed never to feel again, but now, every time he looked at Elizabeth, every time her gaze met his, he was reminded of the very thing he feared: vulnerability. Asterisk, she risked everything for me. What if I'm not worthy of that sacrifice? Asterisk, he would think as he rode through the estate, the wind whipping past him, his mind racing with doubt. Asterisk, what if my love is destructive? What if opening my heart means I'll hurt her, as I hurt Rosalind? Asterisk. The fear was always there, clawing at him, and despite all his attempts to push it away, it kept coming back. He spent long hours in his study, reading and rereading Rosalind's letters, searching for some sort of closure that he had never found. He had buried her memory under the weight of his guilt, but it never stayed buried for long. The letters were full of love and forgiveness, but they also carried the weight of regret, and they never seemed to give him the peace he so desperately sought. As the days wore on, his drinking increased. The brandy, once a rare indulgence, became a constant companion. He would down glass after glass, hoping to drown the gnawing sense of inadequacy that plagued him. But no amount of alcohol could erase the truth. He was terrified. Terrified of losing Elizabeth. Terrified of truly letting her in. Elizabeth noticed the signs, but she did not follow him. She had learned that sometimes people needed space to reconcile themselves with the truth. She let him struggle, but she also struggled with the silence that stretched between them. Every night she lay awake, wondering if she had made a terrible mistake in hoping for something more. Had his confession meant nothing? Was he retreating back into the fortress of his own making, leaving her standing outside? For 2 weeks, Elizabeth allowed him to retreat into his solitude. She kept her distance too, giving him the space he needed. She continued with her duties as Duchess, attending events, managing the household, but the emptiness she had once felt in her marriage grew. The servants whispered, and Elizabeth overheard them. The Duchess and the Duke are no closer than before. Whatever happened at that ball, it wasn't permanent. The words stung more than they should have. The isolation of their marriage had never felt more acute than now. She had hoped for a change after the masquerade, but it seemed as though William's confession had been little more than a fleeting moment, a brief surrender before he pulled away again. Elizabeth lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had been foolish to think that one moment of truth could erase years of fear. Had she made a mistake? Should she have waited for him to come to her, to fight for their marriage, or had she already lost him? It was in the second week that Elizabeth found the letter. She had no intention of snooping, no desire to invade William's privacy, but something led her to his study. She had gone to ask him something trivial, but when she found the drawer unlocked, her curiosity got the better of her. The letter was tucked neatly between the pages of a leather-bound book, addressed to her, "My dearest Elizabeth." The words struck her immediately. The letter was raw, unguarded, and painful. In it, William confessed his love in language that was almost desperate. "Here, asterisk, I love you so completely that I'm terrified of my own feelings. Asterisk." The words poured out in a jumble, each sentence more revealing than the last. Asterisk, every good thing I've touched has turned to ash. How can I believe you'll be different? How can I risk loving you when I know what loss feels like? Asterisk. The letter ended mid-sentence, unsent, unfinished. It was as though he had been too afraid to write the final words. Asterisk, I don't know how to be the man you deserve. I only know asterisk. Elizabeth's heart ached as she read the words. She could see the fear, the uncertainty in every line. He loved her, but he was paralyzed by the ghosts of his past. He was so afraid of losing her, so afraid of being vulnerable, that he couldn't even finish the letter. For the first time since the masquerade, Elizabeth felt truly hopeless. How could she reach him if he was still so buried in his past? But then, something shifted within her. She would not sit idly by, waiting for him to find the courage to love her fully. Elizabeth made a decision. She would go to him, not to demand anything from him, but to offer him a choice, one that he had to make for himself. She knew where he had been disappearing to. She knew the place where he had hidden his grief, his regret, his love for Rosalind. She would find him, and she would confront him not with anger, but with truth. She had waited long enough for him to come to her. Now, she would go to him. The following afternoon, Elizabeth quietly followed William when he rode out across the estate. She kept her distance, moving as silently as the wind. He didn't notice her at first, his back to her as he led his horse to a gate she had never seen before. She dismounted and followed him on foot, heart pounding with each step. Behind the eastern wall of Ashford Hall, hidden away from the rest of the estate, was a garden unlike the others. Overgrown but beautiful, it was a memorial garden, one that William had kept secret for 8 years. Roses in every color bloomed in wild profusion, and forget-me-nots cascaded like a river of blue, their petals soft and delicate. In the center of the garden was a stone bench with a simple plaque, Rosalind Hartley, 1849 to 1871, beloved. William sat on the bench, soaked through, from the rain, as if oblivious to the weather. He was staring at the plaque, lost in his memories. Elizabeth hesitated, watching him from the gate. Then, quietly, she stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. "You found my secret," William said, his voice heavy with resignation. He hadn't turned to face her, but he had known she was there. "I followed you one afternoon," Elizabeth said, her voice soft. "I shouldn't have, but—" "It's all right," William said, finally turning to her. "It's time someone else knew about this place." He looked at her with eyes that were both haunted and relieved, as though he had been waiting for someone to discover the truth. Elizabeth took a seat beside him on the bench, not touching him but allowing the space between them to shrink. The rain continued to fall, but neither of them moved. "You come here often?" Elizabeth said, her voice breaking the silence. "Every day," William replied. "For 8 years I've tended this garden, sat with my guilt, remembered what I lost." "And what you think you deserve to lose?" Elizabeth asked gently. William's eyes flashed with surprise, then soft understanding. "I've always thought I was being punished, that I had to pay for what I did for what I failed to do." "William," Elizabeth began, but her words faltered. She wanted to tell him that he had suffered enough, that he had paid the price, but the truth was more complicated. "I found a letter," she said quietly. "In your study. You wrote to me, but you couldn't finish it." William's face went pale. "Elizabeth—" "It's all right," she said. "I understand." "You're afraid," she whispered, stepping closer to him. "You still are." William closed his eyes, the weight of his own words crushing him. "I wrote that letter 1,000 times in my head. Each time, I couldn't find the words, because the truth is terrifying." Elizabeth's breath caught in her chest as she stared at him, seeing him for who he truly was, a man afraid to love because he was afraid to lose again. "What truth?" she asked softly. "That I love you, completely, irrevocably, and that terrifies me because everyone I love—" He stopped himself, unable to finish the sentence. Elizabeth stood up and walked toward him, her heart open and full of compassion. "Everyone you love doesn't die because you love them, William," she said, her voice steady. "Rosalind died because of circumstances beyond your control. Because society forced you both into an impossible situation. Because she was pregnant and medicine was insufficient. It wasn't your love that killed her. It was the world." William looked at her, his face torn, his heart breaking. "You couldn't have changed the outcome, and you know that. You've known that for 8 years, but you've been using it as an excuse to stay away from life, to stay away from me." Elizabeth knelt beside him, her hand on his shoulder, her voice unwavering. "I will not accept that. I will not accept a husband who is present in body but absent in spirit. I will not spend my life loving a ghost." The rain fell harder now, the earth beneath them soaking through their clothes, but neither of them moved. They were both soaked to the bone, but for the first time, they were truly present together. William stood abruptly, his gaze fixed on the plaque before him. "I don't know how to do this," he said, his voice raw. "I don't know how to love without destroying. Everything I touch turns to gold," Elizabeth finished. "You've built this entire estate from nothing. You've managed it brilliantly. You've treated your tenants with fairness and kindness. You're not a destroyer, William. You're a man who loved so deeply that losing hurt unbearably. There's a difference." He dropped to his knees, not in defeat, but in surrender. His shoulders shook with sobs, his face wet with tears. Elizabeth knelt beside him, holding him as he cried. After what seemed like an eternity, William looked up at her, his eyes filled with something new, something he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. Hope. "I vow to love you every day I draw breath," he whispered. "I vow to be present when I would rather hide. I vow to choose you, choose us, choose life every single day. And when I fail, because I will, I vow to try again." Elizabeth took his hand, her heart full of love. "And I vow," she said, her voice strong, "to love you even when you're afraid, to stand beside you in the darkness, to remind you when you forget that you are worthy of love, that your love doesn't destroy, it heals." They kissed then, their lips meeting in the rain-soaked garden, the weight of everything that had been said between them falling away in that single, desperate kiss. The rain continued to pour down, but neither of them cared. For the first time, they were free, free to love, free to live, free to be the people they had always meant to be. And in that moment, they both knew this was just the beginning. Thank you for joining me on this journey of love, redemption, and discovery. I hope this story resonated with you as much as it did with me. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. And if you're craving another powerful tale, check out the next video. I think you'll love it. See you in the next one.